Colleges want diverse student bodies. If you think they're not going to fully consider you, you're mistaken. You can discuss race and ethnicity in your application if it's important to you and if it helps explain who you are and what you've done. Students should continue to seek colleges that they want to attend and understand that those colleges want them and want to give them full consideration. And as far as counselors are concerned, they should be encouraging students not to pay as much attention to what the court said about this and to pay more attention to what the colleges have shown over the years about these issues. They want more diverse student bodies. Colleges haven't been perfect, but I don't question their motivations. I've talked to enough college personnel to know that they're sincere about wanting diverse student bodies and doing whatever they can within the law to get those diverse student bodies and to give full consideration to applications from underrepresented minority students.
Hi, friends, and welcome back to the podcast. So in this episode, we're talking about the Supreme Court's recent decision to strike down race-conscious admission and what the implications might be for colleges, for students applying to those colleges, and the counselors who advise them. And what better person to talk about it than with Jay Rosner, whose entire career has been devoted to the intersection of law and college admissions. So this is the first in a series of episodes where we'll be exploring the impacts of the SCOTUS decision from a variety of perspectives. In upcoming episodes, you'll hear from Lorenzo Gamboa, who is the Director of Diversity, Inclusion, and Outreach at Santa Clara University, who shares with me some things that Latinx families need to know about preparing for college. And fun fact, if you didn't know this, I was raised in Latin America, so we recorded the episode both in Spanish and English. Rick Diaz then takes us behind the scenes at SMU, that's Southern Methodist University, to give us insight into how they read applications. We talk about some of the impacts of the Supreme Court decision on the supplemental essays that many selective colleges and universities require, and why so many changed their prompts this year. And then in a future episode, you'll also hear me speak with TEDx speaker and current college student Tina Young on why you don't have to write about trauma in your college essay to stand out and what you could do instead. And quick side note, even though you'll hear Jay mention a few times in this episode the possibility that students can write about challenges, I just want to underscore for those of you listening, students, you do not have to write about challenges in your personal statement. See Tina Young episode for more. But in this particular episode, Jay Rosner and I get into what the affirmative action ruling practically means and how it might impact college admissions, particularly for underrepresented students. We addressed some students' fears about whether or not they should mention their race in their application or share experiences directly related to, say, culture. I asked Jay, who's the burden on here? Is it on students or the colleges themselves? We also talk about how counselors should advise students. For those of you who've never met Jay, he's the executive director of the Princeton Review Foundation, and in that role has developed programs jointly with organizations like the NAACP, the Hispanic Scholarship Fund, College and Graduate Horizons, serving Native American students, and the Asian Pacific Fund. His career has combined education and law with an emphasis on student advocacy. He's testified before state legislative committees in California, Texas, Illinois, and New Jersey, and as an expert witness in cases involving standardized testing. Before he went to law school, Jay was a public high school math teacher. He holds a BA from the University of Pennsylvania, a JD from Widener University, and he's the proud father of 2 grown daughters. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Jay, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Ethan. Happy to be talking with you about these interesting and important topics.
Yeah. So I know, Jay, you've been following race-conscious admissions for a long time. Can you give folks I don't want to say quick, but just an overview of race-conscious admissions and why this Supreme Court decision is such a big deal?
Sure. Let's start with the 1970s. Colleges started using affirmative action in admissions. Some would argue it was in the late 1960s, but in that era. And the numbers of underrepresented students, particularly African-American students, began to increase in highly selective programs. And then there was a lawsuit called Bakke against the University of California, Davis's medical school, which had a set-aside program for underrepresented minority students. And a white student filed a claim arguing reverse discrimination. Now, one of the interesting threads in the whole modern history of affirmative action or race-conscious admissions is that the lawsuits, not only starting with Bakke, but starting before Bakke in the 1970s, were all about discrimination against white students, but that term was never used. It was always reverse discrimination and preferences. And so the Supreme Court, starting in the late 70s, affirmed the use of race-conscious admissions through a series of decisions, all the way up to the 20-teens. The first decision, as I said, the first positive decision was against UC Davis Medical School. Then there were cases against the University of Michigan that went to the Supreme Court, cases against the University of Texas in the 20-teens, Fisher 1 and Fisher 2 that went to the Supreme Court. And then finally, the Harvard and UNC cases which were decided in late June of this year, 2023. But all through that series of cases, the use of race-conscious admissions was upheld. It was restricted over time, but upheld until the Harvard and UNC decision, which arguably reversed the use of race-conscious admissions, but not completely, and we can talk about that.
Yeah. So why is this such a big deal?
It's a big deal because of structural racism in our society, which leaves underrepresented minorities who, on average, have weaker, lower-funded K-12 education, less access to resources, and show up in at the college admissions stage with the results of that lack of access to resources. And what colleges realized is if they just paid some attention to race, and among qualified, and this is very important, among qualified underrepresented minority candidates and applicants whom they knew could succeed, if they just gave them what was called in the Harvard case a tip, a slight edge for a qualified candidates to bring in underrepresented minorities, it would diversify their class, which was good for the students, good for the rest of the students, good for the university, good for society. And that was able to be done, again, with some constrictions, right up until June of 2023 with the Harvard-UNC decision.
You said a minute ago that it arguably reverses things. What does the ruling actually mean as far as your reading goes?
Well, Justice Thomas, who's an ultra-conservative on the court, said that it, in effect, overrules Grutter, which was a 2003 decision by the Supreme Court that strongly affirmed the use of race-conscious admissions, and is the one decision, it was written by Justice O'Connor, that I think can be adequately summarized in 2 words. Imagine that, a legal decision that could be summarized in 2 words. And there were 2 words that she used in a complete sentence in the decision, and the 2 words are race matters. And race should be considered in university admissions because it matters. The ruling means that a college is not, well, I say college and applies to college admissions, but I think graduate and professional school admissions are at risk and could be sued under the same principle. What it says is that colleges cannot use and consider race as race. They can consider factors that include race, and specifically mentioned in the majority opinion is obstacles overcome by a student where race is a factor, or inspiration received by a student where their race is a factor, or some third factor that involves race, but is not race itself. And this actually has a historical echo, because one of the things in the Bakke decision in the late 70s that I referred to earlier, one of the things in that decision was that race can't be considered in college admissions with regard to the history of racial discrimination in our society. In other words, societal racism can't be considered, but the race of an individual student could be considered. So what the Supreme Court is kind of updating that in a way, saying the fact that race is a factor in society and that a college might want to be mitigating the history of racial discrimination by giving an advantage to a student of a certain race, that's off the table. That's been off the table since Bakke, but it's really off the table. And in fact, now race itself is off the table, but it can be included if it's part of a larger context of a student overcoming obstacles, etc. So for students, they can include that kind of discussion in their personal statements where they tell their story. And it just, part of the story can't be, I want you to take into consideration the history of discrimination in our country. That's sort of off the table.
What are some of the potential implications in terms of the diversity and inclusivity of college campuses?
Well, history showed us back when California in the mid-90s passed Prop 209, banning affirmative action and race-conscious admissions in higher education, that subsequent to that decision, affecting only the state of California because it was a state ballot initiative, the applications to the state flagships, the University of California, Berkeley, and UCLA, plummeted from underrepresented minority students, particularly from African American students. And there were two reasons posited for that. Number one was Black students and underrepresented minority students got the message that their applications wouldn't be given the full consideration that they might have been given when race-conscious admissions had been permitted prior to that. And secondly, a kind of chilling effect where there was this more general feeling that, well, these universities don't really want me or people who look like me. I'm not even going to apply. Applications plummeted and admissions plummeted, and representation on campus by underrepresented minority students plummeted at places like Berkeley and UCLA. We saw the same effect with a ballot proposition in Michigan Prop 2 in 2006. The University of Michigan, the flagship campus in that system, after that decision, after that ballot initiative passed, was not permitted to use race-conscious admissions. Same thing happened. Applications and enrollment by underrepresented students plummeted. Now, there's a countervailing factor that I'm hoping will mitigate that, or even, I'm being overly optimistic here, might overpower that. And that is, we're in a different era. It's at least possible that underrepresented minority students, after this decision, will sort of feel empowered that they can still tell their story. And there may not be a chilling effect. I hope there isn't a chilling effect as a result of this decision, with educators encouraging students to still apply. And that while race alone won't be considered, race can be considered in combination with one of those other factors. So I'm hoping that with good messaging and some energy on the part of diversity advocates, that we won't see that kind of a chilling effect that we saw in the past.
In talking to a few students, just since the decision came out and, getting questions on webinars, there are some students who worry. They wonder, should I even mention race at all in their application? What would you say to them?
I would say to them, if race is a meaningful part of your story and you don't mention it, you're making a big mistake. And I say that from the experience of sitting through the Harvard trial, where there was testimony by minority students, including Asian American students, who said they believed that their discussion of race in their essays helped them. And there was evidence in their admissions files with comments by admissions officers that supported that. And it was particularly poignant for, I remember, a Vietnamese American student who testified and talked about at great length and detail about how his Vietnamese immigrant experience impacted everything about his life, and most poignantly, his education, and felt very, very strongly that that story really supported very strongly his admissions. And there was testimony by Chinese students who had variations of the same theme. So it's mostly, I think, in the Asian American community where one would hear that kind of sentiment. I would think that Black and brown students would be less subject to not discussing the race, but I don't know. What have you seen evidence or heard evidence to the contrary?
I haven't. And actually, let me make sure I've got your question. Do you mean evidence to the contrary in regards to like what in particular?
In regard to Black students, Latinx or Hispanic students, Native American students saying, I'm not sure I should mention my race.
I think people are just freaked out a little bit and going, is this going to be a thing? Is this, there's a little bit of, what does this mean?
I think that's where the role of diversity advocates to tell students what the situation is, that if race is a part of your story, not only should you mention it, but you would be making a mistake to leave that out, to not mention it.
You've had a lot of experience, and we talked briefly before we started about college horizons. I'd love to just hear a little bit about, give me some examples of students who have talked about race in meaningful ways and ways that you feel like will be sort of within the bounds of the law, as it were. Actually, let me rephrase that question, because I guess I wonder, this might be another way that students come at it. Are students in danger of quote unquote breaking the law, or is the burden really on colleges?
The burden is heavily on colleges. And one of the advantages of this situation is I see no burden on students except as they impose it on themselves irrationally by saying, I'm not going to apply. They don't want me. Or I don't think I'll apply to that school because they're no longer considering race. Those are just erroneous assumptions or conclusions, depending on what you consider them to be. So I see, in effect, no burden of any significance on students whatsoever, which is a good thing. Colleges are in a different situation, and they can be sued, and the people suing them already have 6 votes on the Supreme Court. So that's a dicey situation. The pressure is on the colleges.
So you mentioned briefly an example of a student speaking about how race had been a factor in his life. Can you think of other examples of experiences you've had with students where, just to give students some concrete examples of what's quote unquote okay?
Some of the things that I think about from Native American students are things like walking a half an hour to my grandmother's house to chop wood for her. Now, I suppose there are rural white students who do that. But if that's on a reservation, it's got a different feel and context to it. The lack of indoor plumbing, the lack of internet access. I remember a story about a student taking an online course for the GRE an online prep course. This was a student with an undergraduate degree applying to a master's or a PhD program, living on the reservation, whose internet connection went out at her home. So she traveled some distance, 40 minutes or something, to tribal headquarters, which had internet access until she got there, and that went out. And so it's hard to think of a corresponding situation in the non-native world, but there are those very unique situations that Native American students face.
Let's talk to counselors a minute. What advice would you give to counselors when they are advising students on their essays and application as it relates to students' identity?
I think the key word is context. I've been thinking about this a bit recently, more than I ever have because of the Harvard UNC decision. I'm not an essay guy. I know an essay guy. I'm not an essay guy. I'm a testing guy. But the decision, if you're thinking about students, compels you to think about a student telling their story. And I think what I would say to counselors is, this is about context, and I'm not saying anything to you that you don't know. But from my perspective, the colleges want to understand whatever numbers are in the file or letter grades are in the file, all that written down stuff. They want to have a broader, deeper picture of who this individual is and what this individual will add to their environment on campus. In order to do that, most colleges require essays, and the essay is the opportunity that a student should seize to create the context for whatever else is in the file so that the admissions officers can have a better understanding of who that individual applicant is. And that context should involve the most important things in that student's life that help explain who that student is. And certainly race, ethnicity, speaking a foreign language, those kinds of things have the kind of impact on day-to-day experience, educational experience, objectives, goals, wishes, that leaving them out creates the kind of lack of context that a student shouldn't want for the admission officer to review. They should want the richer, more complete picture of who they are to be considered by the admissions officer. And to the extent that that involves mentioning race, which I would think it would involve for most underrepresented minority students, certainly not all, they should introduce it in a way that's in fact helpful to the admissions officers in understanding who they are.
If there's a student out there listening and thinking, well, I'm not sure if these colleges really want me, if there's a place for me, what would you say to them? And do you sense that there's been any change from the perspective of colleges?
None whatsoever. The overwhelming majority of colleges around the country want more diversity in their student bodies, particularly selective colleges that have been less diverse than they should have been over the years. They want diversity. The messaging, and that's our role as educators, to get that messaging out to students, that underrepresented minority students are really wanted, are really welcome, are really desired by university admissions officers. And that has been the case for a couple of decades now. They shouldn't think that the attitude of the Supreme Court reflects the colleges, because in fact, it's just the opposite. And one of the reasons that the use of race in admissions was challenged in the Supreme Court and not, for example, in Congress, where it could have been challenged, is it's got very broad support in the society. Diversity has very broad support in society. The use of race in college admissions is a trickier question, but the broad and deep support for diversity in colleges by the colleges and universities themselves is overwhelming. And it's entirely contrary to what we just saw from the Supreme Court. So there's actually a lot of tension there.
You mentioned how California voters banned the consideration of race, ethnicity, and gender in college admissions in 1996. And there's a neat article by Femi Ogundele, someone that you know, who works at UC Berkeley. I'm curious, let's talk about colleges for a second. Is there anything you feel like colleges could learn from Berkeley?
Yes, from Berkeley and from the UC system. They tried a lot of stuff to mitigate the damage done by Prop 209 and the results that I mentioned to you earlier of the significant immediate decreases in applications, et cetera, from underrepresented minority students. And they have been successful in a couple of domains. One that jumps out to me is transfers from community colleges. The UCs have been very successful in creating vibrant pipeline transfers from community colleges. And the community colleges are much more diverse than the highly selective universities. So that's been a big plus. They've done a couple of other things that have been successful. They've tried a lot of things that haven't been successful. Overall, all of the things that they've tried have not permitted them to get back, at least in the among the highly selective campuses, to the pre-Prop 209 diversity levels. So I use the word success cautiously there because not everything has helped them. On the other hand, we're in a new era now. In the last 3 years, the University of California has not been considering admissions tests at all. And I think that the removal of the barrier of admissions tests will prove to be an important diversifying tool. I think it has in the last 3 years, and I think it will continue going forward. But there is the question of whether, even with the barrier of tests removed, whether a place like Berkeley can get back to its pre-Prop 209 diversity. That's an open question. So these are challenges for the UC, which has been subject to an affirmative action ban for well over 20 years. And now the challenges for all selective programs all through the country. Now, I should mention that race-conscious admissions is really salient only in the selective programs. For non-selective programs, race-conscious admissions is of tertiary importance, perhaps, just doesn't rise to the level where it's discussed in any length. So this is about the selectives and the highly selectives.
I'm curious to see, if you had a crystal ball, foggy though it may be, where do you see this going?
I think and I hope, and sometimes it's dangerous to conflate the two, but I do think and I do hope that the role of testing will be significantly diminished. It has been significantly diminished already with the now status quo of test optional in the undergraduate level. I think a movement to test free could catch on beyond the 80 universities that are now test free. I think legacy admissions will go. I even think that there will be questioning about the club sports or the country club sports like golf and tennis and the like, which not only are almost entirely white, but are very heavily skewed toward affluent students. And it might be that the affluent angle is a better angle of attack to open up those admissions and financial aid spots to more diverse students. So there are a lot of interesting things that can happen. The barriers, which I see the most prominent ones, test scores and legacy admissions, will tend to go. And the other avenues for white students, and particularly wealthy white students, like those sports, I think will be under some pressure to continue to exist.
Before I do kind of like a closing question, I'm curious if there are any angles on this that you feel like aren't being talked about or things that you're just really interested in.
Well, the 14th Amendment, equal protection under law, the whole range of decision-making, one of the things that I wish were a little more discussed is that the whole range of decision-making from Bakke forward, saying that under the 14th Amendment, you can't consider historical prior racial discrimination. And Justice Jackson has made great comments about how the 14th Amendment wasn't intended to be colorblind. That's the furthest from the historical record. So you have this butchering, if I could use that term, of the 14th Amendment through Supreme Court decisions that should continue to be discussed. They have twisted the 14th Amendment, equal protection under law, beyond recognition to achieve ideological ends. A second aspect I think I might mention is that this decision was so ideological in that they just ignored the facts. There were 100-page opinions from the trial courts and from the appellate court in the Harvard case detailing the extensive factual record that supported the use of race and that showed there was no discrimination. And the Supreme Court just summarily ignored that. And one of the issues with legal decision-making is a court is supposed to consider the facts as found by the trial court and the law. And this Supreme Court ignored the facts. So there are striking anomalies in our legal system and in the Supreme Court's jurisprudence that shouldn't be forgotten, given everyone's now got a focus, everyone in colleges now has a focus of how do we run our admissions, get a diverse class, and not get sued. I mean, those are the front of mind questions. And I hope this history and the contortions that the Supreme Court has gone through to give us an ahistorical decision is not forgotten in this whole process.
What message would you want to convey to, let's say, students or counselors who are still grappling with these changes and some of the challenges?
The main message is colleges want diverse student bodies. If you're an underrepresented minority student, they want you. They have to choose among all their applicants, and they're willing to fully consider you. They can't consider you in quite the same way that they could in prior years, but they are still able to give very extensive consideration to your application. If you think they're not going to fully consider you, you're mistaken. You can discuss race and ethnicity in your application. If it's important to you and you don't discuss it, if it helps explain who you are and what you've done, and you don't discuss it, you're making a mistake. So that students should continue to seek colleges that they want to attend and understand that those colleges want them and want to give them full consideration. Can't always accept them because there are lots of other applications. And as far as counselors are concerned, they should be encouraging students to have those attitudes, that not to pay as much attention to what the court said about this and to pay more attention to what the colleges have shown over the years about these issues, and that is that they want more diverse student bodies and that they've tried in their own ways to get them. Now, that doesn't mean that colleges have made mistakes. I think the mistakes colleges have made is to give preferences to legacy applicants, for example, and essentially take away those slots to be more diverse, to overemphasize test scores. I mean, colleges haven't been perfect, and I question a lot of what they do, but I don't question their motivations. I've talked to enough college personnel to know that they're sincere about wanting diverse student bodies and doing whatever they can within the law to get those diverse student bodies and to give full consideration to applications from underrepresented minority students.
Jay, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, friends, for listening. In the show notes, you'll find links to the actual Supreme Court decision so you can read it for yourself, a resource that was released jointly by the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights and the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division on how to help colleges and universities understand the Supreme Court's decision, if you're listening to this and you're on the college side. And in the coming weeks, we'll be sending out on our email list resources on should you write about race in your college application? And if you decide to do it, how do you do it? And when they're released, you'll find links to the episodes that I mentioned at the top of the show that are part of this continuing conversation. You'll find them all at collegeessayguide.com/podcast. That's it. Be well. Stay curious.